So how about this? Charges for Alec Baldwin could be back on the table in the wake of a new report claiming that he did pull the trigger on the gun that killed cinematographer Helena Hutchins on the Rust movie set almost 2 years ago. The actor has long insisted the opposite.
It wasn't in the script for the trigger to be pulled.
Well, the trigger wasn't pulled. I didn't pull the trigger.
So you never pulled the trigger?
No. I would never point a gun at anyone and pull a trigger at them. Never.
Oh, wow. So Alec Baldwin has some issues that are coming down the pipe because they are seemingly about to charge him again in the Rush shooting tragedy. So just to bring us back to what essentially happened before. So Alec Baldwin was essentially on the set and someone handed him the gun. He gets the gun, he points the gun and he says he pulls the hammer back, but doesn't pull it back all the way, just cocks it back a little bit and the gun goes off. So his argument was he never pulled the trigger. It was the gun misfired and malfunctioned. So at first the DA charged him with involuntary manslaughter. And the theory of the case then was that he was just overly reckless. You don't point a loaded gun at someone, or a gun, any gun, even if it's loaded, if you don't know for sure it's loaded or not loaded. You don't point a gun, a working firearm, at someone, pull the trigger, and then say, I didn't know. That's dangerous. Just like you heard Alec Baldwin say in this clip. But there was this contention that the gun may have malfunctioned. He says he didn't pull the trigger. They had some reports that say he had to pull the trigger, so it was really up in the air. So they dropped the charges, the involuntary manslaughter charges, because under state law, if the gun misfired, if the gun did malfunction, then he doesn't have any criminal liability because that's essentially a true accident, right? Now, how did live rounds get in the gun? That's a whole nother story for the armorer. But the fact of the matter is, Alec Baldwin, someone handing him a gun and he's pointing the gun and the gun misfires or malfunctions, then there's no criminal liability here, right? That's just a tragic accident. Even though somebody died, it's a tragic accident. Now they've come back and got a second opinion about the gun, and it seems like the gun wouldn't have fired unless the trigger was pulled, meaning that Alec Baldwin had to pull the trigger. Now, if that's the case and the prosecutor can prove that, now you got your involuntary manslaughter. Now you have your recklessness, because now what they're going to be saying is that, hey, somebody handed you a gun, you were supposed to check it, but you didn't check it. And then on top of that, you pointed a gun at someone, which you didn't know was loaded or unloaded. You assumed it was unloaded without checking it, and pulling the trigger was the part that now made it unreasonable, right? Because you don't, even if you're pointing a gun at somebody, just like you said in that interview, because that interview is going to be played, you don't point the gun at someone and pull the trigger. That just doesn't make any sense. That's dangerous. And that interview is going to be used as Exhibit A, right? Like he knew this. He knew this. So for him knowing that, that's going to also bring back those charges. But now the DA, we don't know if the DA is going to recharge him or not, because they dropped the charges. As we can see here, they dropped the charges before, but they dropped it without prejudice, meaning they could bring those charges again if they got some new evidence. So he wasn't totally out of the clear. So, I know Alec was happy that they weren't able to bring charges, that they dropped the charges before with prejudice, but there's no statute of limitations on involuntary manslaughter. And now with this new evidence, it seems like Alec Baldwin is going to be in a whole lot of pain. So let's react to this Fox News video and see what's happening in Santa Fe. Now, just for full disclosure, guys know the new Santa Fe DA has, I was representing a client with the Santa Fe DA, and they threatened us because my client, allegedly had some information they wanted, but the client really didn't have the information. They threatened us with subpoenas. It was all BS. And, we're like, all right, well, give us the subpoenas, and nothing actually happened with it. So, the DA is being overly aggressive in some of these spots, even with my client, because I've had to deal with this DA. I was on the phone with the Santa Fe DA, with a client of mine. So, let's see what the new developments are. But I'm assuming that the reason why they're going to maybe bring these new charges, if they're going to bring new charges, is because if you can prove that he actually pulled the trigger, that act of pointing a firearm at someone and pulling the trigger, that in itself is reckless. That's reckless. If he points the gun and it goes off and it's like, oh, it malfunctioned, not reckless. Point the gun and pull the trigger, reckless.
Involuntary manslaughter charges against Baldwin were dropped back in April, reportedly because new evidence revealed that the gun had been modified before he handled it, which would line up with what he said.
Malfunction.
But now, A new expert analysis has been done for Santa Fe special prosecutors who say, quote, the trigger had to be pulled or depressed sufficiently to release the fully cocked or retracted hammer of the evidence revolver. Steve Wolf is a weapons safety expert for films. He's been involved in investigations of accidental movie set shootings, including the 1993 shooting of Bruce Lee's son, Brandon Lee. He's serving as an expert witness in the civil suit against Baldwin, brought by relatives of Helena Hutchins, and also a suit brought by the Rust script supervisor. Steve, good to have you back on the program. Thank you for being here.
And if you think about it, that just makes sense, right? If someone hands him a gun that's modified, that malfunctions in a way where it doesn't do what it would do normally, then it's not his fault because he would have to know it was modified and all that other stuff. But now, if they have a report and they've tried the gun and say this gun couldn't have fired unless the trigger was pulled, then that's a game changer. It's a game changer.
Can you explain this to everybody at home in simple terms about what they thought the gun had been modified, but now they say it hasn't? What are they talking about?
They're talking about how much effort has to be applied to the trigger to make the gun fire. So if you pull this back, and you press here, the gun fires. If you find that this is just too difficult for you, people have modified this to make it easier to fire the gun. And it's irrelevant because there's no part of gun safety that relies on any part of the gun to be working properly. When we say, all guns are always loaded, okay, well, you either loaded it or you checked that it was empty. That doesn't depend on the gun, right? If we say, don't put your finger on the trigger, well, you do or you don't. I mean, I saw photographs that he did. If they say, don't point the gun at somebody, and he did, then he's breaking the rules. So gun safety doesn't rely on mechanical parts because mechanical parts are always subject to fail. And so the idea that the gun being modified or not would have any relevance to the case is moot.
Now, he's right, except in law, you have to prove the mental state. You have to prove the person's mental state. And this time, you have to prove the person was reckless. So in terms of, he's saying, well, gun safety would have stopped this anyway. But if you're handing him a gun that's been modified and he points it at someone and the gun malfunctions, then you can't say that he doesn't have the requisite criminal intent of recklessness because he wasn't being reckless because the gun has been modified to do something out of the ordinary, right? And they are using the gun on a set. So if you're pulling it back and it goes off and it's something that the gun was that occurred as a malfunction, you can't blame him for that malfunction. Think about it this way. If you're driving a car and the speed limit in this area is 10 miles an hour and you press the gas and you're on it, and then the gas pedal gets stuck and is going at 60. You can't now blame the person and say, well, based on car safety, you're supposed to be going X amount, but you're like, well, it's a malfunction. The gas pedal got stuck, so I couldn't stop the car and it just continued to go. That's essentially the difference with the mental state. Now, he's trying to say, well, it doesn't matter because regular gun safety would have stopped this anyway, but that's just not how the law works. The law works with, can you prove that he was reckless at this time? And if you think about it, it's just going to be hard to prove someone's reckless if they're doing everything and the object, the gun that they were using, malfunctioned. That's an accident. And we don't criminalize genuine accidents and malfunctions unless you can prove that person wanted that result to happen. So here, I think legally, Alec Baldwin has a case. If now he can prove that he didn't pull that trigger, because if he pulled the trigger, it's a whole different ballgame, because now you don't have the excuse of, hey, whether it malfunctioned or not, pulling the trigger is something that you were not supposed to do. And if this report is right, saying that gun couldn't have fired unless he pulled the trigger, then I think he's done. I think he's toast.
So, but if he was arguing that it had been modified and that it released without him doing anything, without him pulling the trigger, and now this analysis is saying that is not possible, that he had to have. Is that correct?
That is correct. So let me turn this around so you can see exactly what we're talking about here. If I'm holding the action revolver and I have my finger on the trigger, I'm not, to my knowledge, pressing it, right? I'm just holding it, but I'm actually applying sufficient pressure that if I then cock the gun and release it, it fires. So it'll fire without me pressing the trigger because I'm already pressing the trigger. And so in that instance, it's possible for both people to believe that they're right. He says, I didn't press the trigger, meaning he didn't deliberately press the trigger. And it's also not possible to have caused the gun to fire unless there had been pressure on it at the same time.
So that makes it even more interesting because by him the way he was holding the gun, and that's why they tell you don't put your finger on the trigger, but the way he was holding the gun, there was already pressure on the trigger. So when he pulled it back, essentially fanning the gun and released it, it fired as if he pulled the trigger. So the argument here is Alec Baldwin saying, well, I didn't pull the trigger for the gun to fire. I was just pulling the thing back and the gun malfunctioned. But now, based on the test, they're saying, well, you were already pulling the trigger. And when you pulled the hammer back and let it go, it was the same effect, right? So now it's kind of like, I think you could charge for this. You could charge for this because you can say, well, hey, you were pulling the trigger. Just because you didn't pull the hammer back and then pull the trigger doesn't mean the trigger wasn't pulled. You were already pulling the trigger back. And that was unreasonable in this circumstance. That's what I think the argument's going to be.
So there was a prior prosecutor in this case who's not there anymore, but they spoke with Judge Janine back in January, and here's what she said. This is Andrea Reeb and Mary Kalmack Altwise. Watch.
We definitely believe he pulled the trigger. The FBI lab report confirms that.
Mr. Baldwin had a duty at the base level to never hold a gun and point it at a person while pulling the trigger.
We believe Baldwin, as a producer, knows everything that goes on the set. And so, there was a lot of problems. There were a couple accidental discharges. There was a lot of safety concerns that were brought to the attention of management, and he did nothing about it.
You're nodding, Steve. Real quick reaction.
Well, as soon as you find out that someone is dangerous, you get them off your set. And this particular armor had safety complaints against her from her prior movie, which was her first movie, and then again on her second movie, and they did nothing to remove her or replace her with somebody. So they allowed a dangerous situation to persist.
All right,
with regard to the FBI lab, who are you going to believe, the FBI or Alec Baldwin's lawyers?
It seemed like they believed Alec Baldwin's lawyer. I think the Santa Fe DA dropped the ball because I don't think, like, you say, okay, we're going to charge him because as you saw earlier, they're like, he pulled the trigger, he depressed the trigger, he did all, we know this. The FBI says it had to be done. They seemingly didn't believe the FBI had to get this second opinion, and the second opinion confirmed what the FBI said. Yeah, he had to be pulling the trigger for the gun to fire. He had to be. He had to be. Now, let me know what you would do if you were the district attorney in New Mexico. Because to me, I don't see how he is not charged with this particular act. Again, we're talking about involuntary manslaughter, meaning he didn't mean to do this. We're saying that he was extremely reckless in his handling of the firearm in a way that put people's lives at risk, was a risky situation, and the result of somebody actually getting injured, that's what leads to the charge of involuntary manslaughter. Well, we're talking about an unjustifiable risk. I think we have to also think about this in a very legal way, in the sense of, first, you look at the total situation. Part one, on this movie set, there wasn't supposed to be any live ammunition. That's a check for Alec Baldwin, no live ammunition, right? So even if he pulls the trigger or do whatever, it's supposed to be no live ammo. Number two, there was a safety expert on there who handed him the gun and said the gun was cold, it was all safe and all that stuff. That's another point for Alec Baldwin. The thing that cuts against him is that Alec Baldwin himself, remember in that earlier clip,
well, the trigger wasn't pulled. I didn't pull the trigger.
So you never pulled the trigger?
No. I would never point a gun at anyone and pull a trigger at them. Never.
In that clip, he said, you never point the gun at someone and pull the trigger. So that now goes to his mental state, right? What Alec Baldwin thought. And he thought that was dangerous. It was reckless. It was something that could cause someone harm. And if he's admitting that, that's why sometimes you don't do these interviews. If he's admitting that, then he's admitting to his own mental state that, yeah, the reason why you don't point the gun and pull a trigger because someone could get hurt. And now, if the FBI is saying the only way that gun could have gone off is if someone pulled the trigger, and the second thing is saying, Well, the only way that gun goes off is someone pulls the trigger. And Alec Baldwin is saying shouldn't point guns at someone and pull the trigger. Then how do you not get to recklessness? So he's in some serious legal jeopardy, but we'll see. We'll see if they bring charges again. We'll see if they say, his lawyers are still going to argue this was a malfunction of the gun. The gun was modified and he wasn't pulling the trigger. He's going to say he wasn't. They're going to say he was. But this is what it comes down to. And it's weird. It's just coming down to that one little point. Was he pulling the trigger or was he not? Let me know how you came out in the comments section, and let me know if you're on that jury with these facts. Do you convict? Do you say that he was reckless and he knew that pointing a gun at someone and pulling the trigger was dangerous and he did it anyway? And if that's the case, he may be going to jail. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, do other good YouTube stuff. My name is Nate the Lawyer, and I'll see you next time. Peace.